The 85mm focal length. Isn't it beautiful though? I think it looks incredible. It's one of my favorites actually when it comes to shooting detailed shots of something to make it look interesting. Heck, even me folding the laundry here looks really darn good. It's all about how you frame stuff and what kind of foreground that you use, what kind of background that you have. But the 1.4 aperture of this lens definitely helps to separate the foreground from the background. I'm not going to reveal which lens it is that I'm using right now. And for those of you wondering what I'm eating for breakfast, it's usually 5 or 6 eggs, topped off with a little bit of Swedish caviar. If you ever visit Sweden, you gotta test this out. It's a Swedish delicacy, and I love it. Eggs and caviar, so good. One of my absolute favorite focal length when it comes to making videos is the 85mm. I've been using that for so many videos over the years. And it's been one of those focal lengths that whenever you put it onto your camera, like any of the lenses that I've tried that is 85mm, it just looks good. But there is something that is a little bit special, and that is when you go down to 1.4 on an 85mm lens. And I remember back in 2018 when I tested the good old clunky Sony lens with the 85 1.4 for the first time, and like the images that came out of that thing was insane. Like the bokeh in the background, the sharpness, but the autofocus was so slow even back then that it was kind of hard to use it when you were making videos, because not only was it very loud, but it was also missing a whole lot of shots whenever you tried to use it. With the latest release, which is this lens, the Sony 85mm f1.4 GM Mark II, all of those things are fixed. But it's also a very expensive lens. And this is one of those lenses that you usually invest in if you can get the money back from the work that you make. It's sort of like a workhorse, and it's a work tool, the way that I see it. But I thought to myself, like, is it actually worth paying $2,000 for this lens as compared to the Samyang 85mm f1.4 Mark II, which is coming in at around $600 to $700 here in Sweden, with taxes included. I'm going to give you the answer to which lens it was that I used in the beginning of this video by the end of this video. Looking at two lenses side by side, you can see that both of them look pretty legit with a big lens element up front, and the design of both of these lenses is actually really neat. You can definitely feel that the Sony lens is a little bit more high quality than what the Samyang lens is, but both of these lenses are designed for the full frame E-mount cameras, which I think is pretty cool. But then I also have my good old trustworthy Zeiss Batis. It's not a 1.4 lens, it's a 1.8, but it's also a lot smaller compared to the 1.4 lenses. And there's something about this lens that I've been loving throughout the years. And just for the record, I bought this lens myself, so there's nothing that is being paid for here. And this lens is just a loaner, so there's no obligations to say anything good about any of these lenses. And this one I bought, I think it was, what was it, like 2018, 2019? Bought it on credit. Not a good choice. Let's start out with the Samyang build quality. We're gonna have a look at that. We have custom button right here, which I think is nice. We're gonna zoom in a little bit. A couple of different angles today. I'm just testing things out. Custom button here, it says M2, M1. Another button which you can customize, probably set the focus and that kind of stuff. You do have a focus ring, which I think is nice, but something that I did notice whenever I was using it is that it feels a little bit slow. So when you turn it, you had to just turn it for so long before you actually move the focus back or forth. But it feels good and it looks good as well. Looking here in the back, we have a gasket, sort of like a weather sealed gasket. It's not too big, but it's not too small either. And it's actually a smaller filter thread than what you have on the Sony, because the Sony is a 77 one. I think that this is 72 or 60. No, it has to be 72. Moving on to the Batis, you can see that we got a weather sealing gasket here in the back as well. It's actually a little bit thicker than what it is on the Samyang, but you also get this nice OLED display, which, to be honest, I haven't found much use for. I think that it's just more of a gimmick rather than actually something that is useful, because everything is built into the camera right now. Looking at the filter thread, we have a 67mm filter thread, which I think is nice because the filters for this lens is actually going to be a bit cheaper. And if you go for the Tamron lenses and this lens, you're going to be able to use the same kind of filter thread across the lenses in general. Not all the Tamron lenses, of course, but some of them. And moving on to the big boy here, the 85 GM Mark II. Can't say anything bad about the Sony build quality because I love the fact that they are so ruggedly built and so incredibly well made overall, because just look at that front element lens and then the aperture ring that I think is insanely good to have if you're making a lot of videos. The reason for it is because if you choose D-click here on the side, then you're going to be able to sort of like seamlessly go between the different apertures. So if you're shooting inside at 1.4 and you're changing lighting scenarios, then you can just turn it to f8 or f11 or whatever it might be without hearing any clicks. And there's going to be sort of like a seamless transition from the dark environment to the bright environment, but you're not going to be able to see it in the shot because you adjusted it here. And this is actually a feature that I used a whole lot whenever I was shooting the music video for Dead by April back in April of last year, I think it was. Wow, time flies, huh? But when I was shooting with 7200 GM, I adjusted the aperture depending on how close they were to the lights that we had set up. And it was actually pretty sick to be able to have that. So it's definitely a nice feature and I love that the lens has that. And you also have two customizable buttons that you got right here and also the iris lock switch. But it also feels kind of lightweight. It's not too heavy and it's actually very solid. So how do these lenses perform then? Well, I'm gonna throw up 3 different shots, or it's actually kind of the same shot, but it's with 3 different lenses. And when you're just looking at them initially, it's gonna be very hard to tell which one is which, but you can see the lack of contrast and detail in the Samyang lens when you compare it to the Zeiss Batis. But the fun thing is that when you compare the Batis towards the GM, I wouldn't say that it's that much of a difference when it comes to the image quality alone. I actually prefer the look of the Batis, if I'm gonna be completely honest, and I really wish that the Batis did have a 1.4 aperture, because in that sense this lens would be my go-to. But when you're taking photos, I mean, any of these lenses will perform great. If you need to have the best of the best image quality, it will be, of course, the GM Mark II. But do I think it's worth spending the money for this? I'm gonna say no. Just looking at it, I think that the Batis is actually the best bang for the buck. And it's also one of the reasons why I still love this lens. It has a special place in my heart, I guess you can say. And I've never once been disappointed on the image quality of this lens. And I just think it performs and creates such a beautiful image whenever you're shooting with it. But when it comes to the autofocus performance, as I talked about previously, the Samyang is not up to the standard that I would actually recommend this lens and say like, hey, this is going to be your workhorse, because it's not actually a workhorse. This is something that hasn't happened with the previous lens. So it recognizes that the lens is on there, right? And whenever I'm trying to focus, it simply doesn't focus, even if I use the center focus button. Let's see what happens if we restart the camera. There we go. It's not a reliable lens. And I think that that is the most important takeaway that I got from testing these 3 out. When it comes to the Batis though, I've never once had an issue with the autofocus being bad on this, but there is of course a trade-off with the 1.8 aperture instead of the 1.4, but it's like, for the money that you pay, it is a wide lens. But if you want to have crème de la crème, then of course this lens is like, it's unbeatable in almost every single sense. But this is why I say that this is made as a work tool. It's basically the same as you go out and you buy one of those screwdrivers on Walmart, and then you go to the most expensive professional tool and then compare the two side by side. This is made for the professionals that is using these lenses every single day, such as me, and know what they want to have in a lens. Like, I would never go out and buy the Samyang myself, mainly because I can't rely on it. And if I can't rely on my tools working the way that I want them to be, then it's gonna be a waste of money basically. If you don't want to use the autofocus, and if you're using a lot of manual focus instead, which I think is a great thing to do, then this lens is probably gonna be the best bang for the buck. Because the opening sequence that you saw in this video was actually shot with this lens. You probably guessed it by now, right? The Samyang also gives you a little bit of a warmer tone, so you can absolutely see that in the video when you compare this side by the other ones. But as I said, you know, this is a comparison, so when you compare them side by side, there will be differences. But if you were to remove and just use the one lens, there would probably be nothing that you would react on when it comes to the image quality. I am gonna recommend this one though. The Zeiss Batis 85mm f1.8. Still think that this is one of the best lenses that I got ever. But I would love to know, which lens do you think is the best one? Do drop a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I would love to see you in the next video, va?